Hey everyone, this is Nem, and today we're going to be talking about Features Rewritten Ultimate in patch 7.2 and how 7.2 changed the Ultimate raid indirectly, making it more difficult and redesigning pretty much all of the problems that we have with it from the ground up. But first, we need to go into a bit of a brief history lesson. So with FRU, it came out in the thing that a lot of people observed is that there's not really much of a DPS check in FRU, especially in the mid phases. I mean, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, right? In particular, just kind of easy on DPS. As it turns out, and as we're mostly familiar with now, that happened because Picto was overtuned. Picto was doing so much damage that it trivialized a lot of the DPS checks. The content was still ultimate quality, it was still a good level of difficulty, and the DPS checks weren't so bad as they were in Savage because of Picto. There was still something there, but it wasn't what it was supposed to be. Picto was making this fight so much easier that people were locking Picto to PF, saying, well, you gotta take Picto, you gotta do this, you gotta do that. And now in 7.2, some job rebalancing has occurred, mostly to the caster role and the melee role. All melees, not just melee DPS, but tanks as well. And so you would think, maybe we have some kind of new balance or what have you. But the reality is we have multiple aspects of things going on that should be covered. And we have ideas from before 7.2 that might not actually be accurate. So let's talk about this. The three things I want to cover with you today are 1, the DPS checks in general, 2, the job balance, and 3, the increased difficulty. We'll start with the increased difficulty. So here's the reality. Picto can't carry anymore, guys. Pictomancer is not as strong as it was anymore, guys. And you might say, well, how do you know that? Act hasn't been working. Well, Act is working if you update it. And you can see the numbers. Now, in my raid group, the one thing that we struggle with is mechanics, but you know what we don't struggle with is damage. For a long time, we've had no issue with the DPS in FRU at all. And now in 7.2, we still don't have an issue with the DPS. So I can rely on our group's DPS, and I'm comparing it to a lot of Party Finder groups, where now what we're seeing is that players who have cleared FRU, they have weapons, and they are progging on the same job, not progging, but they're helping or they're trying for reclears on the same job they cleared with, do not do enough damage to get through FRU. And they don't realize that it's them who's not doing enough damage. We're seeing a lot of people have cleared FRU, but they don't know their rotation as well as FRU requires now for you to know, because Picto can't carry anymore, guys. Picto is not so overtuned that you can just breeze through on a fizz range, not pressing your buttons correctly, not doing burst properly in burst windows, right? You have to do that now, or not managing your buffs to the party optimally. You can't just throw dance partner on now and just AFK dance partner the whole fight. You actually have to be aware of which jobs are good in which phases, and you need to be aware of which players on your team are performing well enough. Those are two very important things that historically in current ultimates you had to know, right? You had to be aware. That's your responsibility. They have brought that back into FRU, improving FRU even more with 7.2 by nerfing Pictomancer. So after looking through PF and looking through logs and doing some testing, I'm seeing that Picto in its burst window is still better than Blackmage temporarily during the burst window, but they lose overall on output in each phase. They are now weaker, but they give a raid buff to the party, so they also buff players like Machinist and Blackmage and Samurai. Samurai is really, really strong now. It's considered overpowered even by some because they buffed all the melee, right? Job balance is that all melee, tanks included, have had buffs to account for not having uptime during the new Savage fights and other stuff like that. But that means on older fights, they just got a raw buff. So melee are eating really well in FRU right now, tanks especially, because I mean, well, except for Paladin, who got their AoE nerfed in Phase 4, but for the most part, they're doing great. But casters are not doing great. They're not doing as well as they were. Technically, Summoner and Red Mage have been bumped up, so if you specifically play that caster, and only that caster, then yeah, when you play that caster, you're doing more damage than you were. That's great. But the role as a whole was top of the top in FRU, and that's not always the case now. With the balance of Blackmage and with the balance of Picto changing, it now more specifically comes down to critical hit rate, honestly. Like, so for example, in my group, we run Machinist, we run Picto, we run Blackmage, and we run Ninja. In Phase 1, who's the best in Phase 1 is almost always going to be, at the end of Phase 1, Machinist or Blackmage. Usually Blackmage, sometimes Machinist. And at the end of the opener, it's going to be any of the DPS, any of the 4. It depends on who crit the most, right? For Phase 2, it ends up being either Picto or Blackmage or Ninja. And in Intermission, it's sometimes Machinist, sometimes Picto, sometimes Blackmage, and occasionally Ninja. Who's the top damaged is very dependent on the crit rate right now, where, dare I say it, it feels balanced. Yeah, weird, right? We haven't heard that in a while. I don't think the balance team is doing a super great job on balancing the jobs themselves when compared to themselves and what you would expect them to do and what you think they would do. But in FRU, anyways, in Ultimate, this 7.2 patch was targeting FRU, and I think they actually hit their target because the jobs feel balanced. The thing about it, though, the thing about the balance hitting this kind of like melee are more valuable, casters are less valuable, but the weak casters got buffed, the strong casters got balanced. What this leads to is that double caster comp probably isn't as good as it was. Double melee comp is going to be better, slightly, depending on the quality of your melee players. But ultimately, it's balanced to the point where your players just have to be good. The comp doesn't really matter, right? The jobs you pick don't really matter. You just need to play well. And I've been testing this because Machinist got nerfed, guys. Machinist got nerfed in 7.2 even more when it was already quote-unquote dead. But the Machinist in my group is top damage sometimes in some phases. He does great damage, and the thing is with a Machinist, we do have a few raid buffs. We have Picto, we have both healers, Astro and Scholar, and we have Ninja, Trick Attack, right? Those are our raid buffs. And those raid buffs are shooting our Machinist up really, really high. Really, really high. He's doing great. We do not struggle with any DPS checks. It is very lenient throughout the entire Ultimate. The only one that scares me a little bit sometimes is Phase 4. The very end, I'm like, oh, I hope we don't screw this up. But we don't. We're getting to P5, right? DPS is not an issue. And that's what the Machinist. Like, it just doesn't matter. It's all about player skill. It's all about player latency. And it's all about proper rotation. Here's the problem. There is now an importance and a responsibility in FRU to manage your personal buffs that was not important before. If you are an Astro, you need to know what jobs to give cards to and when to give them those cards. If you are a dancer, you need to know what phases jobs are weak in and who to give dance partner. You can't just look at the balance and listen to them and say the balance says give it to a melee, so I'm giving it to Viper in Phase 1 because Viper sucks at Phase 1. So now I'm going to give it to the Picto. Why would you give it to the Picto if they're performing less than the Blackmage? Give it to the Blackmage. Oh, you have a Ninja. Give it to the Ninja in Phase 1, right? But swap it in Phase 2. You know what I mean? Like, you've got to know what you're doing. And unfortunately, the reality of dancer players is that through the years, the dancer balance just kind of comes out with like a general prio list that has been tested only in a vacuum. And very rarely do dancer players actually educate themselves to the degree that they could with dance partner. Dance partner, you like... back in the day, you just gave it to the highest DPS. Then it changed to, oh, I need to give it to like specifically someone who attacks very quickly. So, for example, only spell speed Blackmage would ever get Dance Partner in Shadowbringers, late Shadowbringers, if I remember correctly. And crit Blackmage would never get it because their casts were too long, right? So, there was a level of, whatever to it, and then that changed to it went back to just give it to the highest DPS, right? Which people would say is melee DPS because they have the highest, but they only have the highest because they have downtime. So in practice, in reality, outside of a perfect sim scenario, those melee DPS aren't usually the highest damage in the group. Not usually, because they drop uptime because they have to. There's just unavoidable loss. That's how the game is designed. But there are some melee jobs that, like, it really doesn't matter even with the dropped uptime. They're a caster, they're a samurai, and they just blow everyone out of the water. Well, hey, then you give it to the samurai. But the reality is you need to know the intricacies of Dance Partner and understand, like, this is how in a perfect world, this is the prio I would use. But you also have to be aware of how your group is performing. If the Black Mage isn't doing damage, you don't give Dance Partner to the Black Mage. You know? So it's one of those things where understanding the mileage of your personal buffs is now important in FRU. A lot, and the reason I say this is because a lot of PF groups are failing P1. I'm seeing groups wipe with 15% boss health left at Enrage P1. And these are groups that have players in them that have cleared FRU on the job they're progging. I've seen Pictos with their FRU weapon wiping to P1 15% Enrage. Is it that particular Picto's fault? Partially. Is it also mismanagement of raid-wide buffs, or even not raid-wide, just specific buffs like cards and Dance Partner? Absolutely. There's a lot of people not pressing their rotations correctly. There's a lot of people misusing their buffs. They don't know any better. They just read the balance and like blindly follow it. And the reality of the balance is there's some really talented and great players in there, but each job's balance is gonna have different levels of accuracy and value, and you need to take it with a grain of salt to understand why you're given the information you're given so that you can make a good judgment call in the game, right? So if you know, well, the balance information says to do this, but that balance information is tested in a vacuum, it's not always going to be accurate, then you can say, I see it's not accurate here. My group is wiping to DPS. Let me swap it to someone else instead of just being like, it's not my problem. You know what I mean? So that's kind of the situation that we are at. Good news for Pictos is that you're still bursting harder than Blackmage. So you're more valuable as a card target. But here's the reality. Machinist is more valuable than Picto during burst. So during some phases. So there's an art to it, right? There's a lot of knowledge that you can gain there. And that, I would say, is the interesting part of playing Astro or playing Dancer. That's where the depth is like understanding that you need to know everything else going on to be the best that you can be. That's pretty cool, you know? But a lot of people don't know. So they're wiping to P1 and P2 or barely scraping by P3 DPS checks and FRU PF, and then what are they doing? Well, it's not my fault, so I'll put up a clear for one group and just get carried. And then that same person is in PF every day doing a clear for one group and not getting their clear. Why is that happening? Because probably, although maybe not always, probably they're not ready to clear, right? That's just the reality. So right now we're going through a time where FRU PF is mostly clear for me's. It's all about me, and you have like 12 people doing a clear for me group. And if they would all just get into a group together, they'd all get the prog that they actually need. They're not ready for clear. There are some people who have seen Enrage, right? In the PF, 5%, 3%, 1% Enrage, whatever. And those people are probably pretty clear ready, because the last phase of FRU, it's not the hardest phase in the world. It's just easy to mess it up, right? So if you can do the mechanics, you'll probably clear. Just don't drop your 2-minute. That's the reality. So anyways, that's kind of where patch 7.2 did completely change the ecosystem that we live in for FRU. And of course we have Savages coming, like tomorrow, although I don't know when I'll release this video, but anyway, tomorrow. And I'm curious to see how things pan out as we get, you know, the more public release of the Act fix, so that everyone has Act updated, not just some people. As we see the new fights and the new movement, like what is the state of the game going to be in? Because right now the state of FRU is actually in a much better place, and I love seeing the meme that like, oh, your clear isn't as cool because it was easier in 7.1 or whatever, you know. Like it's funny to me because we usually see that meme say the opposite, right? Like usually it's like, oh, you didn't clear before the 0.2 patch, so you're gonna have an easier time clearing, GG, you know. And it's all a joke. Like nobody actually cares or thinks it's, oh, you did it or you didn't do it on time. Like nobody thinks like that. That's asinine. But it is weird to see the meme kind of flip on its head. I don't think I've ever seen that. I can't think of a time where I did. So it's been fun. But anyways, that's a state of balance. You know, like you really do need to have your rotations worked out. You need to be learning from other players. You need to optimize because the ultimates do demand it of you. And even if you're a paladin right now, for example, I had a group that couldn't get past intermission. When I looked through the logs, when I looked at the metrics, you know why? It was because the paladin wasn't doing enough damage in intermission. They just didn't prepare in the prior phase, and then they didn't have their 1 minutes lined up for intermission. And this is like a P5 to clear group. P5 to clear, wiping the intermission because of the paladin, you know. And so that's just one of the things where it's like, it is everyone's responsibility in Ultimate. And I think we have a lot of new people in Dawntrail Ultimate, and I think we have a lot of people who have unrealistic expectations because from the start of the expansion, Picto has been OP. So that has affected the entire player base. No one has had to do a good job, as good of a job as prior, because Picto has been everywhere, and every Picto group has had just an abundance of free damage, an abundance. Which means it was really embarrassing before when like you had a DPS check wipe with a Picto in the group. Like if your Picto died and got weakness and then you wiped, you're like, we're really not doing enough damage here, you know. But now things are normal. Things are back to normal and things are good. From what I can tell, we might see this damage like trend over time to give new information. Like so, you know, when we get more data points. But from the data points we have and from what I've seen, that's kind of where we're at. But that could change, right? We could actually be like, oh, we didn't have enough data to see the truth, and maybe we'll see that it's actually a little bit different. But key takeaways: do your rotations. FRU's different. Machinist is actually good in FRU. Like, don't buy into the hype. A good machinist pumps in FRU. They might need some raid buffs to get there, but I've seen it, man. Like I've seen the light. Like don't dread. Like if you are a machinist lover, you need to perform really well. Just be aware that maybe you need some raid buffs. Maybe you need some raid-wide raid buffs from the healers, whatever, to get there. But hey, man, like, machinists can excel really well. I don't know if it excels with no raid buffs, but I do know that there are clears in 7.1 with machinist, no raid buffs. So, hey, you know, follow your heart. Play the job you want to play. Just make sure you are really good at it. Also, one thing I almost forgot to bring up is people are throwing away their Frubis for the new pentamelded gear and stuff like that, or the new dungeon set. You're wrong. Stop doing it. It is costing you damage and giving you life. You do not need more life. You need more damage. And the damage check is reaching a point where people are wiping because they're wearing the wrong gear sets. Like, that's crazy to me. I don't think people know. Let me just quickly explain how it works before we end the video. Is that FRU is synced to item 735 if you have any gear that is above item level 735, which is everything besides what you were wearing before. It will sync down to 735. Synced down gear maintains some attribute advantage, like having more vitality, but you lose the value of your materia. So you lose direct hit, you lose crit, you lose speed, you lose whatever you have for materia is not counted, which means your HP might be higher, but your DPS is lower. So do not throw away the gear you were wearing because it's going to be BIS and FRU until 7.3. In 7.3, we'll probably swap it out for 735 item level dungeon gear. That's just how it goes. And then in 7.3, you can actually say FRU is now easier to do with the new dungeon gear. So if you clear in 7.2, hey, that's a big deal still. That's because it's harder now than it was in 7.1. So take some pride in that. Go and do it. And for the groups that were already just memeing on this fight and like saying it's like really easy, right? You're still not going to have an issue in 7.2. It's not that much of an increased difficulty. But for the people who were improperly playing before, you're going to find a lot more difficulty. And the sad thing is it is hard to pinpoint just at first glance where the source of the issue is coming from. So a lot of people are saying things like, oh, we have a Blackmage, because they don't realize Blackmage is doing great damage now, right? And they'll say other things. They'll be like, we have a machinist. Dude, machinist is really good. Like, you better know what you're talking about before you accuse people, you know? But anyways, that's all for me. Thanks for watching. Until next time, this is Nem. See ya.